Richard Angels gazed out over the city of Chicago from his office on the 40th floor. The sky was gray, matching his mood that morning. His eyes scanned the urban landscape without truly seeing it, as his mind wandered through the numbers of the latest financial report he had just analyzed. Another quarter of record profits, another series of successful acquisitions, more money for a bank account that was already overflowing. And yet, the emptiness in his chest only grew. His fingers drummed on the solid mahogany desk as he contemplated his distorted reflection in the window. At 38, Richard was the embodiment of success in the eyes of the world. His name appeared in major business magazines, and his fortune grew at a pace even he struggled to keep up with. But that morning in particular, the weight of all that success seemed to crush his shoulders. His assistant entered the room quietly, placing another stack of documents on his desk. "Mr. Angels, the board is waiting for the 9 o'clock meeting," she informed him in a neutral tone, already accustomed to his perpetually closed-off demeanor. Richard merely nodded, not bothering to respond. The people around him had long grown used to his taciturn nature, his calculated coldness, his emotionless efficiency. As he walked down the mirrored hallways toward the conference room, Richard noticed employees subtly shrinking back as he passed. He knew he was feared, respected, but never truly admired. People whispered in the halls about his ruthlessness in business, about how he had built his empire by swallowing up smaller companies. The meeting unfolded like all the others: numbers, charts, projections. Richard led the discussions with surgical precision, cutting down ideas he deemed weak, approving aggressive market strategies. His mind, however, seemed elsewhere. Between analyses, he caught himself thinking about his empty mansion, the solitary dinners, the endless nights. When the meeting ended and everyone had left, he remained seated, staring at his laptop screen without really seeing anything. His achievements felt increasingly hollow, each business victory more bitter than the last. What had happened to that idealistic young man who dreamed of making a difference in the world? When had he turned into this money-making machine? He decided to leave early that day, an unusual break from his routine. His driver, Paul, seemed surprised to see him leaving the office before nightfall, but made no comment. In the back seat of the armored BMW, Richard closed his eyes, feeling the exhaustion he'd been trying to ignore for weeks, maybe months. The traffic was particularly chaotic that afternoon. As the car crawled along Michigan Avenue, Richard watched the crowds rushing along the sidewalks. Ordinary people with ordinary lives, ordinary problems. For a moment, he envied them. They probably had families waiting at home, noisy dinners, fights over the remote control, worries about paying, bills. His mansion in Highland Park was a monument to loneliness. 5,000 square feet of luxury and emptiness. The expensive artwork on the walls seemed to mock him, reminders of how much money he'd spent trying to fill a void that couldn't be filled with material things. That night, alone in his private study, Richard sipped a 30-year-old whiskey as he flipped through old photographs. He found a picture of his parents who had passed away over a decade ago. His father, a small business owner, had always said that true success lay in making a difference in people's lives. What would he say if he saw his son now? His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Sandra, his most recent girlfriend, breaking up with him via text. Not even that surprised or hurt him. She was just another person who couldn't breach the walls he'd built around himself. Lying in his king-sized bed, Richard stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of every decision that had brought him here. Success had a price. He'd always known that. But now, for the first time, he questioned whether it had been worth it. The silence in his ears was deafening, and not even the state-of-the-art sound system playing soft classical music could dispel the sense of isolation. Before falling asleep, he looked out his bedroom window one last time. The city glittered. Below, millions of lights, millions of lives unfolding simultaneously. And he, in his ivory tower, had never felt so disconnected from everything and everyone. What he didn't know was that fate was about to place something in his path that would completely change his perspective on life, success, and happiness. His last thoughts before sleep were of the next planned acquisitions, of how to grow his fortune even further. Little did he know that soon His priorities would undergo a radical transformation, and his definition of wealth would be entirely redefined by an unexpected encounter on the chaotic streets of Chicago. The next morning began like any other for Richard. The alarm went off promptly at 6, and he followed his meticulously planned routine: a workout in his private gym, breakfast prepared by his personal chef, the latest financial news echoing through the empty house via the sound system. But there was something different in the air, a restlessness he couldn't name. The morning meeting was particularly tense. One of the company's longest-serving executives had made a grave error in an international negotiation, and Richard didn't hesitate to humiliate him in front of everyone. His words came out like razor blades, sharp and precise, leaving the middle-aged man on the verge of tears. As he watched the executive leave the room with his head down, Richard felt an uncomfortable pang in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time: remorse. When he left the building, the Chicago sky was especially gray, as if reflecting his state of mind. Paul, his driver, sensed something was wrong when Richard asked to take a different route than usual. "I need to clear my head," was his only explanation. Traffic on the avenue was at a standstill. Cars honked incessantly, street vendors weaved between vehicles, and the typical Chicagoan irritation hung in the air. Richard checked messages on his phone, trying to ignore the chaos around him, when something caught his attention. At first, it was just a subtle movement, almost imperceptible amid the urban confusion. On the sidewalk, partially hidden behind a newsstand, a small figure moved strangely. Richard adjusted his designer glasses, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. It was a child, a little girl, and there was something terribly wrong with the scene. "Paul, pull over," he ordered abruptly. The driver, surprised by the unexpected command, obeyed immediately, finding a spot by the curb. Richard opened the door before the car had even come to a complete stop, ignoring Paul's protests about safety. As he approached, the details of the scene became clearer and more disturbing. The girl couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. Her clothes, dirty and torn, hung off her small frame like rags. But what made Richard's blood run cold were the ropes. Rough, coarse ropes tied around her ankles as if she were an abandoned animal. The most shocking thing, however, was the indifference of the people passing by. Executives with leather briefcases, women carrying shopping bags, young people absorbed in their phones. They all walked past the girl as if she were invisible, as if her suffering were just another part of the urban landscape. Richard felt something stir inside him, an emotion long dormant. Anger, compassion, guilt, maybe a mix of all three. Without a second thought, he approached the girl. She immediately shrank back, like a wounded animal bracing for another blow. "It's okay," he said, his usually authoritative voice now soft and hesitant. "I won't hurt you." He knelt slowly, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible, in his $10,000 Italian suit. The girl's big dark eyes stared at him with a mix of fear and suspicion. There was something in that gaze that struck him deeply, an ancient, sad wisdom entirely out of place in a child so young. With careful movements, Richard began untying the knots of the ropes. His hands, accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts and manipulating financial markets, now trembled slightly as they freed those small, bruised ankles. "What's your name?" he asked gently as he worked on the knots. The girl remained silent but didn't try to run. When the last rope fell away, Richard noticed the red and purple marks they'd left on her skin. Paul had approached, watching the scene with visible concern. "Mr. Angels, maybe we should call the authorities." "No," Richard cut him off sharply. Something inside him knew this wasn't the time for bureaucracy and official procedures. This child needed immediate help, and for the first time in years he felt a clear purpose in his actions. With infinite care, he reached out toward the girl. For a tense moment, she just stared at him, as if assessing his soul through that deep, wounded gaze. Then, to his surprise, she didn't resist when he picked her up. Her body was so light, so fragile. Richard could feel her ribs through the thin, dirty fabric of her clothes. A lump formed in his throat as he realized she probably hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe weeks. Carrying her back to the car, Richard felt the world around him shift in perspective. The towering buildings, the luxury cars, the gleaming storefronts, all of it suddenly seemed insignificant and obscene compared to the almost weightless burden of that child in his arms. "Home, Paul," he ordered as he settled into the back seat with the girl. She curled against him, her small body trembling slightly. Richard removed his jacket and wrapped it around her, noticing how she seemed even smaller enveloped in the fine fabric. As the car navigated Chicago's chaotic traffic, Richard looked down at the child in his arms and knew with a certainty he hadn't felt in years that his life was about to change completely. What he didn't yet know was just how deep and transformative that change would be, not just for the girl, but for himself most of all. The arrival at the mansion was marked by a heavy silence. The little girl stayed quiet, her big eyes taking in every detail of the surroundings with a mix of fear and curiosity. Richard led her inside, feeling strangely out of place in his own home. The enormous, elegantly decorated rooms seemed even colder and more impersonal in the presence of that fragile child. Mary, the housekeeper who had worked for him for years, dropped her duster when she saw them enter. Her face showed a mix of shock and concern. "Mr. Richard," she began, but he interrupted her with a gesture. "Prepare a warm bath and find some clean clothes for her," he ordered, his voice softer than usual. "And then make something light for her to eat." Mary nodded quickly and hurried upstairs, still casting confused glances over her shoulder. In the bathroom of the master suite, Richard faced his first major challenge. The girl refused to let go of her dirty clothes, clinging to them as if they were her only protection in the world. Her eyes, once empty, now showed palpable terror. "It's okay," he tried to reassure her, feeling completely unprepared for the situation. "No one's going to hurt you here." The words sounded hollow even to him. How could he promise safety when he clearly knew nothing about caring for a traumatized child? Mary returned with some children's clothes she'd borrowed from the gardener's daughter. With patience and gentleness, she managed to convince the girl to let them help her bathe. Richard watched from the doorway, feeling both relieved and powerless. For the first time in his life, his money and influence seemed utterly useless in the face of a challenge. During the bath, the marks on the girl's body revealed a history of suffering that made Richard's stomach turn. Old scars mixed with fresh bruises, silently narrating a story of abuse and neglect. Mary cleaned each wound with maternal care, whispering sweet words that, though they elicited no response, seemed to calm the girl a little. "We need to take her to a doctor," Mary whispered to Richard once she'd finally dressed the child in clean clothes. The girl was now sitting on the king-sized guest bed, looking even smaller amid the Egyptian cotton sheets. Richard agreed, but something worried him. How would he explain the presence of this child? What story would he tell? His actions, though, motivated by compassion, could easily be misinterpreted. He, who always had an answer for everything, now found himself navigating uncharted waters. That night brought new challenges. The girl refused to eat, eyeing the bowl of soup Mary had prepared with suspicion. Her small hands trembled whenever anyone approached, and her eyes constantly darted toward the room's exits, like a caged animal searching for an escape route. Richard tried various approaches. He offered different foods, attempted conversation, even did something he'd never imagined. He sat on the floor beside the bed and began telling stories. His voice, usually used for giving orders and closing deals, now tried to find a soft tone to narrate children's tales he barely remembered from his own childhood. It was during one of these attempts that something unexpected happened. The girl, who hadn't made a single sound until then, whispered something so quietly Richard almost missed it. "Rose." He stopped mid-sentence, his heart racing. "Is that your name, Rose?" he asked gently, trying to keep the emotion out of his voice. The girl didn't respond, but her eyes met his briefly before returning to the floor. That single word, that whispered name, was like a small victory in the midst of a battlefield. Rose. Finally, the child had a name, an identity beyond the marks of suffering on her body. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He stayed in his library, frantically researching childhood trauma social services, psychology on his laptop. The hours passed as he absorbed information, trying to understand how he could help that small wounded soul fate had placed in his path. From time to time, he went to Rose's door and watched her sleep. Her rest was uneasy, marked by small whimpers and sudden movements. Sometimes she even let out soft cries, as if reliving moments of terror in her dreams. Mary had offered to spend the night in the room with the girl, but Rose seemed calmer when left alone. The only thing she accepted was a small nightlight whose soft glow kept the shadows of the night at bay. As he watched that small, sleeping figure, Richard felt a mix of emotions he couldn't name. How was it possible that in less than 24 hours, his life had changed so drastically? He who had always planned every step of his career, every move in the business world, now found himself completely lost, guided only by an instinct he hadn't even known he possessed. The next day would bring new challenges, he knew. He'd need to find a discreet doctor, someone who could examine Rose without asking too many questions. He'd need to think of a legal solution, a way to protect the girl without her being torn away from him and thrown into the system. But for the first time in a long time, Richard felt he was doing something truly important. The mansion, which had always seemed too big, too empty, now had a new purpose. The silent hallways, which had once echoed only with his solitary footsteps, now held the soft breathing of a sleeping child. And that night, as the city slept outside, Richard Angels made a silent promise. He would do everything in his power to heal that small, wounded soul. The following days became a roller coaster of emotions and challenges. Richard managed to contact Dr. Helen Sanders, a pediatrician known for her discretion and expertise in childhood trauma cases. Her private office opened exclusively for them on a Sunday afternoon when no other patients were present. Rose initially resisted the idea of leaving the mansion. Her small fingers clung to the sheets with surprising strength, and her eyes silently pleaded not to be taken away. It took nearly an hour of gentle conversation and soft promises to convince her to get into the car. The doctor's office, despite its cheerful and welcoming decor, couldn't ease the tension evident in Rose's body. She stayed glued to Richard, her small hands gripping his pant leg as if afraid he might disappear at any moment. Dr. Sanders showed admirable patience. With a calm voice and gentle movements, she gradually approached Rose. The examination revealed what Richard had already feared beyond the visible injuries. There were signs of severe malnutrition and other health issues that would require immediate treatment. She's been through significant trauma, the doctor explained later in her office while Rose waited with Mary in the lobby. The physical marks are concerning, but it's the emotional scars that worry me most. Her selective mutism is a clear response to severe trauma. Richard listened intently, each word feeling like a weight on his chest. The doctor continued, "She'll need specialized psychological support in addition to medical treatment, and most importantly, she needs stability and safety. Any sudden changes now could cause further damage." When they returned home, Richard noticed Rose had withdrawn even further. The simple medical exam had been an ordeal for her, reopening wounds that went far beyond the physical. That night, the nightmares were worse. Her screams echoed through the mansion's hallways, making Richard rush to her room multiple times. On one such occasion, he found her curled up in a corner, shaking violently. Without thinking, he sat on the floor near her, keeping a safe distance to avoid scaring her further. Then he began to speak, not about anything specific, just soft words, memories from his own childhood, stories about when he too had been afraid of the dark. Surprisingly, his voice seemed to have a calming effect. Gradually, Rose's trembling subsided. She didn't come closer, but her eyes, fixed on him, seemed less frightened. It was in that moment Richard realized something fundamental. To help Rose, he would first need to learn to face his own fears and vulnerabilities. The days settled into a delicate routine. Richard completely reorganized his professional life, working more from home. His mornings, once filled with endless meetings, now began with the silent ritual of having breakfast with Rose. She still didn't eat much, but she was slowly accepting small portions of food. Mary became an invaluable ally. Her maternal, patient presence brought a necessary balance to the situation. She knew exactly when to step in and when to give space, a wisdom Richard tried to learn by observing. One afternoon, as Rose played quietly with some toys they'd bought for her, Richard watched from his office. She meticulously arranged a row of stuffed animals, adjusting each one with almost obsessive care. Suddenly he realized he was crying. Silent tears streamed down his face as he watched that child who, despite all her suffering, could still find a moment of peace in something so simple. It was then that his phone rang. It was his lawyer, concerned about the legal implications of the situation. "Richard, we need to formalize this. You can't just keep a child in your home without any documentation. There are procedures, laws." The lawyer's words sounded distant as Richard continued watching Rose. How could he explain that some things went beyond procedures and paperwork? How could he translate into legal terms the silent bond beginning to form between him and that small wounded soul? "Do whatever's necessary," he finally replied. "But she's not going to any shelter, any institution. She stays here." That night, while organizing some documents in his library, Richard found an old photo of himself with his parents. He must have been about Rose's age in the picture, his smile wide and carefree. How long had it been since he'd smiled like that? When had he lost that ability to simply be happy? The sound of soft footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Rose stood in the library doorway, her bare feet making almost no noise on the hardwood floor. She held one of the stuffed animals, a small white rabbit, against her chest. "Want to come in?" Richard asked gently. To his surprise, she took a few hesitant steps toward him. She didn't come close, but it was nearer than she'd ever ventured on her own. That small gesture, those few steps toward him, meant more than any million-dollar contract he'd ever signed. It was a beginning, a small show of trust he silently promised to honor no matter the cost. As weeks turned into a month, every small progress Rose made was silently celebrated by everyone in the mansion. Her first smile, shy and almost imperceptible, happened one Sunday morning when Mary dropped a tray of pancakes, creating a comical mess in the kitchen. It was just a flicker, a brief upturn of the corners of her lips, but to Richard it was like seeing the sun rise after a long night. Sessions with child psychologist Dr. Beatrice took place 3 times a week in a specially adapted space in the mansion. At first, Rose refused to enter the room alone, only agreeing if Richard stayed nearby. Over time, she began tolerating the therapist's presence alone, though she still didn't speak. "Her trauma runs deep," Dr. Beatrice explained after one session, her face showing genuine concern. "But there's progress. She's starting to express herself through drawings, and that's a positive sign." Rose's early drawings were dark, shadowy figures and violent scribbles that made Richard's heart ache. But gradually, timid colors began to appear. A yellow sun here, a red flower there, small signs of life emerging from the shadows of her past. Richard was changing too. His employees noticed the difference in his behavior during video conferences. The calculated coldness had given way to a different kind of serenity. He was still efficient and decisive, but there was a new dimension to his interactions, something that could be called compassion. One afternoon, while working in his home office, Richard heard a noise from the garden. Looking out the window, he saw Rose sitting on the grass, watching a butterfly that had landed nearby. Her face was serene, almost hypnotized by the insect's wing movements. Then something extraordinary happened. "Pretty," she whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible. Richard froze, afraid any movement might break that magical moment. It was the first word she'd spoken since saying her name. Mary, who was watering nearby plants, also stood still, silent tears running down her face. That night at dinner, something changed in their established routine. Instead of eating in silence, Rose pointed to one of the fruits on the table and whispered again, "Want." The simplicity of the request made Richard choke on his food. It was the first time she'd expressed a desire, actively asked for something. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the apple and handed it to her. Dr. Beatrice's reports began showing more significant progress. Rose was developing a bond of trust, still fragile but real. Her drawings now included a tall figure next to a small one, representations of her and Richard according to the therapist. However, not everything was progress. There were still terrible nights when nightmares attacked with full force. During these moments, Richard learned to recognize the signs, how she curled up, how her eyes widened with terror. He developed a routine for these occasions. He'd sit on the floor of her room, keeping his distance, and begin softly singing old lullabies his mother used to sing to him. One such episode was particularly intense. Rose woke up screaming, more frightened than usual. But this time something different happened. Instead of curling up in the corner as she usually did, she ran to Richard and threw herself into his arms, sobbing violently. The sudden contact took him by surprise, but his body reacted instinctively, wrapping her in a protective embrace. He could feel her heart racing like a small frightened bird. "It's okay," he murmured, rocking her gently. "You're safe now, I promise." It was the first time Rose had allowed prolonged physical contact since arriving at the mansion. Richard felt the weight of that trust like something sacred, a responsibility greater than any business he'd ever managed. The days that followed brought more words, still whispered, but increasingly frequent. Water, hungry, sleepy. Simple words that carried profound meaning. Each one was a small victory, a brick in the reconstruction of trust that had been brutally destroyed in her short life. In Richard's office, a folder grew day by day. Medical reports, psychological evaluations, legal documents, all the necessary paperwork to formalize Rose's guardianship. His lawyer had warned about complications, the questions that would arise, the investigations into her past. But Richard was determined. No matter the cost, he would give Rose the security and stability she deserved. One night, as he watched her sleep peacefully, something that had rarely happened at first, Richard realized his own life had found new meaning. The mansion, once a symbol of his lonely success, was now a home. The empty hallways had filled with the small sounds of a child healing, growing, learning to trust again. But fate still held greater challenges for them both. Rose's past, with its dark secrets, wouldn't stay buried forever. And Richard would need all his strength and determination to protect the fragile happiness they'd begun building together. Rose's progress continued, slow but steady, like a delicate flower blooming after a harsh winter. Her words, once rare and whispered, began gaining a little more volume and frequency. She still didn't form complete sentences, but her requests and expressions became clearer each day. It was on a seemingly ordinary afternoon that the past came knocking at the mansion's door. Richard was in his office reviewing important documents when Mary hurried in, her normally serene face marked by worry. "Mr. Richard, there's a woman at the gate. She says she's Rose's mother." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He stood abruptly, knocking over some papers. "Where's Rose?" "In the back garden with Dr. Beatrice. They're having their therapy session." Richard took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. For weeks, his private investigators had searched for information about Rose's family with no success. And now, this woman appeared out of nowhere, claiming to be her mother. "Don't let her in," he ordered, his voice tense. "Call security and keep Rose away from the front gate." Through the security cameras, Richard watched the woman. She looked to be in her 30s, but her worn face and too thin body made her appear much older. Her clothes were dirty and unkempt, and her movements were erratic, suggesting possible drug use. "I know she's in there," the woman shouted, her hoarse voice echoing through the intercom. "You can't keep my daughter, she's mine." Richard felt a wave of anger rise through him. How dare this woman show up now after all Rose had suffered? The marks on the girl's body, her nightmares, her fear, all were silent testimony to the hell she'd endured. But he needed to stay calm. Any wrong move now could jeopardize the ongoing guardianship process. With trembling hands, he picked up the phone and called his lawyer. "George, I need you here now. The situation we discussed. It's happening. While waiting for the lawyer to arrive, Richard monitored the situation through the cameras. The woman remained at the gate, alternating between angry shouts and tearful pleas. Some pedestrians had begun stopping, curious about the commotion. Mary entered the office again. "Mr. Richard, Rose is asking about the shouting. She seems scared." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation. "Tell Dr. Beatrice to take her to the back bedroom, the one overlooking the winter garden, and turn on the ambient sound like we do during storms." But it was too late. When Richard reached the hallway, he found Rose frozen halfway down the stairs, her wide eyes fixed in the direction of the front gate. Even through the mansion's thick walls, the woman's voice was audible. "Rose! Mommy's here! Rose!" Rose's small body began trembling violently. Her eyes, which in recent weeks had begun showing signs of life, were now filled with primal terror. Before Richard could reach her, she let out a high-pitched scream and ran upstairs. Richard found her under the bed, curled in the fetal position, her hands covering her ears so tightly her small fingers were white. Her entire body shook, and she'd reverted to complete muteness. "Rose," he called softly, his heart breaking to see her like this. "No one's going to hurt you, I promise. No one's taking you away from here." The lawyer's arrival brought some relief. George managed to convince the woman to leave, arranging a formal meeting to discuss the situation, but the damage was done. Rose spent the following days in a near catatonic state, refusing to eat or leave her room. Dr. Beatrice made daily visits, trying to help Rose process the reactivated trauma. The appearance of the biological mother triggered all the traumatic memories we'd been working through, she explained to Richard. "We need to be very careful now. Any progress we've made could be lost if we don't handle this properly." At night, when everyone had retired, Richard sat on the floor of Rose's room, as he had in the early days. She remained hidden under the bed, but he could feel her listening to his voice. "You know, Rose," he spoke softly, "when I was little, I was scared too. Not the same kind of fear you have, but fear all the same. And you know what my mom used to tell me, that being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means facing fear, even when it feels too big." As he spoke, Richard fought back his own tears. How do you explain to a child that sometimes the people who should protect us are the ones who hurt us most? How do you promise safety when the world seems determined to hurt that small soul yet again? The days that followed were filled with intense legal activity. George worked tirelessly, gathering evidence of neglect and abuse, preparing the documentation needed to secure permanent guardianship of Rose. The investigation into the mother's past revealed a history of drugs and violence that only confirmed Richard's worst fears, but also provided legal ammunition to protect Rose. Slowly, very slowly, Rose began emerging from her state of shock. First came small signs. She accepted a glass of water from Mary, allowed Richard to sit a little closer to her bed, began holding her stuffed rabbit again. One night, as Richard read a book while sitting on her bedroom floor, she finally spoke. Her voice was just a whisper, but her words carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. "Don't let her take me." Richard felt his heart break and mend in a single instant. "Never," he replied, his voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "You're home now, Rose. This is your home and I'm your family." The days following the incident with Rose's biological mother were like walking on thin ice. Every step had to be calculated, every word measured. The fragile progress they'd made seemed to have retreated into the shadows, leaving only fear and distrust in its place. Richard completely reorganized the mansion's security. Cameras were installed at strategic points, the security team was doubled, and strict protocols were established for any visitors. He knew he was being perhaps excessively cautious, but the image of Rose trembling under the bed still haunted him. One morning over coffee, Richard realized he was developing fears of his own. Every time the phone rang, his heart raced. Every suspicious movement near the mansion gates put him on high alert. He, who had always been known for his cool rationality in business, now found himself consumed by constant anxiety. "You need to take care of yourself too," Mary said one afternoon, watching him push food around his plate without really eating. "The girl needs you strong." The housekeeper's words struck him hard. She was right. In his obsession with protecting Rose, he'd forgotten he needed to maintain his own emotional stability. That same afternoon, he began his own therapy sessions. Dr. Beatrice now saw them both. Rose in the mornings, Richard in the afternoons. During one session, the therapist shared an interesting observation. "You two are healing together, you know. Rose is learning to trust again, and you, Richard, are learning to allow yourself to be vulnerable." The legal process for Rose's permanent guardianship continued. George, his lawyer, brought mixed news. The biological mother, after that first appearance, had disappeared again. This was good for the case, but Richard couldn't let his guard down. He knew she could reappear at any moment. It was during this tense period that something unexpected happened. Richard was in his office participating in an important video conference when Rose appeared at the door. Normally, she never interrupted him during work, a silent agreement they'd established. But this time was different. She held a drawing in her small hands, and her eyes held a determination he'd never seen before. Richard asked for a pause in the meeting and turned to her, concerned. Rose approached, extending the paper. It was a crayon drawing, something she'd started doing in her therapy sessions. In it were two figures, one small, one tall, holding hands in front of what looked like the mansion. Above the figures, written in shaky but legible letters, was a single word: family. Richard felt his throat tighten. It was the first time Rose had expressed so clearly how she saw their relationship. More than that, it was the first time she'd written something on her own. "It's beautiful, Rose," he managed to say, his voice thick. "Can I keep it?" She nodded, then did something that left him completely stunned. She stepped forward and hugged him. Not the desperate hug from before when she was scared. This was a conscious hug chosen, a gesture of genuine affection. From that day on, something changed in their dynamic. Rose began expressing herself more, not just with words, but with small gestures. She started leaving simple notes for Richard, drawings, single words, even a hesitant "good morning." Therapy sessions also took on a new dimension. Rose began using dolls to represent her past experiences. Through them, she could express things she couldn't with words. Dr. Beatrice explained it was a safe way to process trauma. One night, as they watched a children's movie in the TV room, something that had become a Friday ritual, Rose asked a question that caught Richard by surprise. "Why did you save me?" It was the first complete sentence she'd formed, and the content of the question made Richard's heart ache. How do you explain to a child that sometimes there's no rational why, that some things just need to happen? "Because," he began, choosing his words carefully, "sometimes life puts us on the right path even when we didn't know we were lost. I didn't save you, Rose. We saved each other." She was silent for a long moment, processing his words. Then, without looking away from the TV, she said something that would forever change both their lives. "Are you my dad now?" Richard felt silent tears stream down his face. "Only if you want me to be," he replied softly. Rose took his hand, a gesture that was becoming increasingly natural between them. "I want to," she said, her voice small but firm. That night, after Rose fell asleep, Richard stayed a long time in his office, looking at the drawing she'd made, now framed and hanging on the wall. The word family glowed under the soft lamplight, reminding him that sometimes the biggest changes in our lives begin in the most unexpected moments. But as he silently celebrated this moment of progress, Richard couldn't imagine that fate still held even greater challenges for their newly formed family. Rose's past, with its dark secrets, wasn't done revealing all its shadows. Autumn arrived in Chicago, bringing cold winds and unasked-for memories. It had been nearly 6 months since Rose entered Richard's life, and the progress was visible to anyone who knew her story. The girl now smiled more often, spoke in complete sentences, though still quietly, and had even begun taking private lessons at home. The mansion had changed too. The once austere, impersonal rooms now had childish touches, drawings on the walls, toys organized on shelves, and a bedroom that looked like it came from a fairy tale, specially decorated for Rose. Richard himself had transformed in the eyes of his employees and business partners. The hardness in his gaze had been replaced by something softer, more human. But on a seemingly ordinary afternoon, the past came haunting their lives again. Richard was in an online meeting when Mary hurried into his office, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Richard, there's a woman here. She says she's Rose's grandmother." The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Unlike Rose's mother, who had appeared clearly disturbed and under the influence, this woman waiting in the living room looked respectable and carried documents, proving her identity. Helen Martinez, Rose's maternal grandmother, was a woman in her 60s, well-dressed, with an air of dignity that starkly contrasted with their image of the girl's mother. In her hands she held a folder with newspaper clippings and old photographs. "I've been looking for her for 2 years, Helen explained, her voice trembling slightly. "My daughter, she disappeared with Rose when the girl was 3. I tried everything to find them, but Carla was always good at disappearing when she wanted to." Richard listened in silence, his heart racing. Rose was in her music lesson on the other side of the mansion, protected for now from this new development in her story. "When I saw the news about the adoption process in the papers, when I saw her photo, I could hardly believe it," Helen continued, tears now streaming down her wrinkled face. "She looks just like her mother did at that age." The folder Helen brought contained a painful history. Photos of Rose as a baby, smiling in her grandmother's arms, medical records from her early years when she still lived with family, and then the newspaper clippings, small notes about a missing child, police reports, missing posters that had never yielded results. "Carla started with drugs as a teenager," Helen explained, her voice heavy with sorrow. "We tried to help, in every way possible, rehabs, therapy, but nothing worked. When Rose was born, I thought maybe this would be her chance to straighten out. For a while it seemed like it was, but then..." Richard could feel the pain in the older woman's words. It was different from what he saw in Rose's eyes, but no less real. It was the pain of someone who had failed to protect those she loved, who had been forced to watch helplessly as her family fell apart. "Where is Carla now?" Richard asked, dreading the answer. Helen lowered her eyes. "I don't know. The last time I saw her was 3 months ago when she showed up at my house asking for money. She was unrecognizable. When I learned Rose was here, I tried contacting her, but..." A heavy silence fell over the room. Richard could hear in the distance the soft notes of the piano Rose was learning to play. The music, a simple beginner's melody, seemed surreal against the gravity of the moment. "Mrs. Martinez," Richard began, choosing his words carefully, "I need you to understand something. Rose has been through traumas no child should experience. It took months for her to start trusting, to speak, to feel safe. I can't let anything threaten the progress she's made." The older woman nodded, slowly. "I didn't come to cause trouble, Mr. Angels. I came because she's my granddaughter, and because I've spent the last 2 years imagining what horrors she might be enduring. When I found out she was safe, that she was being cared for, it was like a great weight lifted from my chest." At that moment, the study door opened slowly. Rose stood there, her large dark eyes moving between Richard and the unfamiliar woman. Something in her gaze suggested she'd already understood more than she should have. Helen let out a choked sob. "Rose," she whispered, bringing her hands to her mouth. The little girl took a step back, instinctively moving closer to Richard. Her small body trembled slightly, but there was something different in her posture, not the same paralyzing fear as when her mother had appeared. "It's okay," Richard said softly, reaching out to her. "No one's going to hurt you, no one's taking you away from here." Rose held his hand tightly, but her eyes remained fixed on Helen. There was something in her look, a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Are you my grandma?" she asked quietly, surprising both Richard and Helen. The older woman could only nod, unable to speak through her tears. What followed was a moment of almost palpable tension. Rose, still gripping Richard's hand firmly, took a small step forward. "I remember you," she finally said. "You used to sing to me." Helen covered her face with her hands, openly sobbing now. Richard could feel the conflict in Rose, the desire to reach out, fighting against the deeply rooted fear of trusting someone from her past. Then Rose did something that showed how much she'd grown in recent months. She let go of Richard's hand and walked slowly toward Helen. Stopping at a safe distance, she said in a small but firm voice, "I don't want to leave here. This is my dad now." The words hung in the air like a declaration of independence. Helen, still crying, nodded quickly. "I know, sweetheart, I know. I just wanted to know you're okay." "I am," Rose replied, and for the first time since entering the room, a small smile appeared on her lips. "I'm really okay." Helen's presence in Rose's life added a new dimension to her recovery. Unlike the paralyzing fear she felt toward her mother, Rose's memories of her grandmother, though vague, were positive. Richard watched every interaction closely, always ready to intervene at the first sign of distress, but Rose showed surprising resilience. The visits began in a controlled, supervised manner, always with Dr. Beatrice present. Helen brought old photos, shared stories of Rose's early years, filling gaps in a past that had until then been shrouded in shadows. For Richard, it was like watching a puzzle being assembled piece by piece. "She always loved music," Helen remarked one afternoon, watching Rose at her piano lesson. "As a baby, she'd stop crying instantly when you sang lullabies." Richard absorbed each piece of information like a precious treasure. Every small detail helped him better understand the girl who had transformed his life in ways he'd never imagined possible. However, not all moments were peaceful. One particularly difficult afternoon, Helen brought disturbing news. "Carla's in the hospital," she said quietly, after Rose had gone to bed. "Overdose. The doctors, they're not very optimistic." The news hit Richard like a punch to the gut, not for Carla's sake, but for what it would mean to Rose. How do you explain to a child that her biological mother was fighting for her life because of the addiction that had destroyed their family? Rose doesn't need to know yet, Richard decided, after a long conversation with Dr. Beatrice. She's just starting to feel secure, to trust. We can't risk a setback. But fate had other plans. One Sunday morning, as they had breakfast in the garden, a ritual they'd established in recent weeks, Rose asked a question that caught everyone off guard. "She's really sick, isn't she?" Richard nearly choked on his coffee. "Who, sweetheart?" "My mum," Rose replied, her eyes fixed on her hot chocolate. "I heard you and Grandma talking last night." The silence that followed was heavy. Richard exchanged a worried glance with Helen, who was also present for breakfast. How careless they'd been to let Rose overhear that conversation. "Yes, Rose," Richard finally answered, opting for honesty. "Your mother is sick. She's in the hospital." Rose remained quiet for a long moment, absently stirring her chocolate with a spoon. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but firm. "Is she going to die?" The question, asked with a bluntness startling for a child her age, made Richard's heart ache. Helen stifled a quiet sob. "We don't know, sweetheart," Richard replied, reaching for her small hands. "The doctors are doing everything they can to help her." Rose nodded slowly, as if processing the information. Can I pray for her?" It was Helen who answered, her voice thick. "Of course you can, darling. I'm sure she'd really like that." That night, Richard found Rose kneeling beside her bed, whispering a prayer Mary had taught her. The scene touched him deeply. Even after all she'd endured, that small soul was still capable of compassion. The following days were filled with silent apprehension. Rose continued her routine, lessons, piano, therapy. But there was a new shadow in her eyes, a worry no child her age should carry. During a session with Dr. Beatrice, Rose expressed something surprising. "Sometimes I dream about her," she said while drawing. Not how she was at the end, but before, when she still smiled and called me my little angel. The therapist, who had documented every step of Rose's progress over the months, noted something significant in this revelation. "You can remember the good things too, not just the bad. That's very important, Rose." Richard, who was observing the session at Rose's request, felt tears welling in his eyes. It was an incredible evolution for someone who months earlier couldn't even speak about her past. One afternoon, while playing in the garden, something that had become increasingly frequent, Rose asked another surprising question. "Dad?" she began, and Richard still felt his heart swell each time she called him that. "Do you think people can change?" Richard thought carefully before answering. "Yes, I do, but they have to want to change, and they need help to do it." "Like I changed?" she asked, her big eyes fixed on him. "Yes, like you changed, and like I changed because of you too." Rose smiled, that smile that lit up her entire face and warmed Richard's heart. "Then maybe she can change too someday." The hope in Rose's voice was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Richard pulled her into a hug, feeling her small body snuggle against him. "Maybe, sweetheart, but what matters is that no matter what happens, you're safe now. You have a family who loves you." "I know," she replied simply, and in those two words was a certainty that made Richard silently grateful for the miracle that had transformed their lives. But fate still had one last card to play, a twist no one could have predicted, one that would test the bonds of this newly formed family in ways no one could have imagined. The phone call came on a Wednesday evening. Helen, her voice trembling, informed them that Carla had woken from her coma. Against all medical expectations, she was conscious and surprisingly lucid. Most astonishing of all, she'd asked to enter a rehabilitation program. Richard received the news with mixed emotions. On one hand, he was genuinely glad for Carla's potential recovery, not for her sake, but for what it might mean to Rose. On the other, he feared this sudden change might destabilize all the progress they'd made. Dr. Beatrice was called for an emergency consultation. Rose needed to be told, but how? How do you explain that the mother who'd abandoned and hurt her was now asking for a second chance? "Rose has developed remarkable resilience these past months," the therapist observed. "She's stronger than we realize, but we must be very careful how we present this situation." They decided Helen would be the first to speak with Carla, to assess her true condition and intentions. Richard couldn't sleep, tossing and turning as devastating scenarios played out in his mind. What if Carla demanded Rose back? What if all their progress was undone? What if? His thoughts were interrupted by a small noise at the door. Rose stood there clutching her stuffed rabbit, silent tears running down her face. "Are you going to send me away?" she asked in a broken whisper. Richard felt his heart shatter. How had she sensed something was wrong? He quickly rose and scooped her up, feeling her small body tremble. "Never," he replied firmly. "You're my daughter, Rose. Nothing will change." That she clung to him tightly. "Promise?" "I promise with all my heart." The next morning, after a mostly sleepless night for both of them, Richard and Rose sat together in the garden. With Dr. Beatrice's help, he explained the situation as gently as possible. "Your mother woke up," he began softly, "and she's trying to get better." Rose was silent for a long moment, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her dress. "Is she still mad at me?" The question stabbed at Richard's heart. Even after all this time, after all the progress, part of Rose still believed she was to blame for her mother's behavior. "No, sweetheart," he replied, holding her small hands. "Your mother should never have been mad at you. What happened wasn't your fault, it never was." Dr. Beatrice, observing the interaction, noticed something important in Rose's demeanor. The girl didn't show the same paralyzing terror as before when speaking of her mother. There was fear, yes, but also something more, perhaps curiosity, perhaps hope. The days that followed were filled with intense preparation. Helen visited Carla daily at the rehab center, reporting every small progress. For the first time in years, Rose's mother was genuinely committed to recovery. "She asks about Rose every day," Helen shared during one visit, "but she understands she needs to prove she's better before any contact." Richard marveled at Rose's strength during this period. She continued her routine, school, piano, therapy, but now there was a new element in her conversations. She began asking questions about her mother, trying to understand what had happened. "Why do people get sick like that?" she asked one night as Richard tucked her in. "Sometimes," he began carefully, "people get lost. They try to escape their pain the wrong way and end up hurting themselves even more. Rose processed this in silence, like when I hid under the bed. Richard felt a lump in his throat. Yes, something like that. But you were very brave and learned to face your fears. Your mother is trying to do the same now. A month passed. Carla continued progressing in rehab. The doctors were optimistic but cautious. Richard remained vigilant, always prepared to protect Rose at the first sign of danger. Then, one Sunday afternoon, Rose made a request that surprised everyone. "I want to write her a letter," she announced at lunch. Richard exchanged glances with Helen and Dr. Beatrice, who was also present. The therapist gave a slight nod, indicating this could be a positive step. The letter Rose wrote was simple, as only a child could make it. "Mom, I hope you get better soon. I'm learning piano and can play Happy Birthday now. Grandma says you played too when you were little. I'm okay here. Dad Richard takes really good care of me and I'm not so scared anymore. Do you still like butterflies? There are lots in the garden here. Love, Rose." The letter acted as a catalyst. Carla responded with one of her own, supervised by her therapists. It was an honest letter, no empty apologies, acknowledging her mistakes and expressing genuine desire to change. Richard watched this process with a mix of apprehension and hope. Rose was handling the situation with maturity surprising for her age. She still had moments of fear and insecurity, but now could talk about her feelings, voice her concerns. One night, while playing a new song on the piano, something that had become her favorite way to express herself, Rose made an observation that showed how much she'd grown. "You know, Dad, I think my heart grew bigger." "How so, sweetheart?" "Before I thought you could only love one person at a time, but now I know I can love you and Grandma and still have a little space to hope Mom gets better." Richard hugged her, moved, realizing his little girl was teaching him one of life's greatest lessons about love and forgiveness. But fate still had one last surprise for this family that had learned to rebuild itself from life's fractures. A surprise that would forever change how they all understood the meaning of redemption and unconditional love. The day of the reunion was carefully planned. After 3 months of exchanged letters and steady progress in rehab, Carla was ready to see Rose. The meeting would take place in Dr. Beatrice's office, a neutral and safe environment for everyone. Richard barely slept the night before. He spent hours watching Rose sleep, her small body peaceful under the covers, trying to draw strength from her serenity. How could she, a child who'd been through so much, remain so calm before such a significant moment? That morning, Rose surprised them all by carefully choosing her outfit, a light blue dress Helen had given her, with a ribbon in her hair that Mary helped arrange. In her arms, she carried the ever-present stuffed rabbit, no longer as a shield against the world, but as an old friend giving her courage. The office was prepared for the meeting. Dr. Beatrice had removed her desk, creating a more welcoming space with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. In one corner, toys and art supplies were available in case Rose needed distraction. Carla arrived first, accompanied by Helen. The months of treatment had wrought a visible transformation. Her face, once ravaged by addiction, had regained some color and life. Her eyes, though still carrying the weight of her past choices, were clear and focused. When Rose entered the room, holding Richard's hand firmly, time seemed to freeze. Mother and daughter looked at each other in silence, each carrying a universe of emotions in their gaze. "Hi, Rose," Carla was the first to speak, her voice trembling slightly. "You look so beautiful." Rose squeezed Richard's hand tighter, but took a small step forward. "Hi," she replied quietly. "You look better." The simplicity of the observation broke some of the tension in the room. Carla let out a choked sob, but remained composed, respecting her daughter's space. "I'm trying to get better," she said. "Your letters, they helped me so much." Rose nodded, processing the words. Then, to everyone's surprise, she let go of Richard's hand and walked to one of the chairs, sitting with her rabbit in her lap. It was a silent invitation to dialogue. The conversation that followed was one of the most extraordinary Dr. Beatrice had witnessed in her career. Rose, with wisdom beyond her years, let her mother speak, explain, ask for forgiveness. But she also expressed her own feelings, her fears, her hurts. "Why did you tie me up that day?" she asked at one point, her small voice firm. Carla closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "I wasn't well, sweetheart. I was very sick, couldn't think straight. I know there's no excuse for what I did, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am." Richard watched the interaction with his heart in his throat, ready to intervene at the first sign of Rose's distress. But his daughter, and now he was absolutely certain she was his daughter in every way that mattered, showed surprising strength. "I was so scared," Rose continued, "but I'm not anymore. Dad Richard taught me that being strong isn't about not being afraid, it's about facing fear." The words struck Carla like a revelation. She looked at Richard then, with profound gratitude in her eyes. "He's taken such good care of you, hasn't he?" "Yes," Rose replied simply. "He's my dad now, but—" She hesitated a moment. "I think I can have two different kinds of love in my heart. Dr. Beatrice says that's possible." Then something extraordinary happened. Rose stood from her chair and walked to Carla. Carefully, as if handling something very fragile, she held out her stuffed rabbit. "He helped me when I had nightmares," she explained. "Maybe he can help you too when things get hard." Carla covered her face with her hands, sobbing openly now. Helen, who had watched the scene in silence, was also crying. Richard felt his own face wet with tears. "I can't take him," Carla managed between sobs. "He's your special friend." Rose smiled, that smile that lit up the whole room. "I don't need him the same way anymore. I have Dad, Grandma, Mary, I have a whole family now, but you're still learning to be strong." The wisdom in that 7-year-old left everyone speechless. Dr. Beatrice, who had witnessed Rose's entire transformation, wrote in her notes, "Today I saw the true meaning of healing. The meeting lasted an hour, but its impact would be felt forever." When it was time to leave, Rose hugged Carla, a quick, still hesitant hug, but real. "I'm glad you're trying to get better," she said. In the car ride home, Rose was quiet for a long time, looking out the window. Finally, she turned to Richard with a serious expression. "Dad?" "Yes, sweetheart. I think I understood something today." "What's that?" "That sometimes people break, but they can be fixed. Like that vase Mary glued, remember? It never looked the same as before, but it can still hold pretty flowers." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat, once again amazed by the depth of that small girl's soul, the one who had transformed his life in ways he could never have imagined. What none of them knew then was that this meeting was just the beginning of an even more extraordinary journey of healing and redemption, one that would change not just their lives, but the lives of many others who would cross their paths. A year had passed since that first morning Richard found Rose tied up on the sidewalk. The mansion, once a symbol of his lonely success, now overflowed with life and love. The walls, once decorated only with expensive art, now proudly displayed Rose's colorful drawings, each telling a story of her healing journey. The transformation wasn't just physical. Richard, once known as the ruthless businessman who built an empire through cold determination, was now viewed differently by employees and business partners. His new perspective on life had changed how he conducted business too. One Sunday morning, as the whole family gathered for breakfast in the garden, a sacred tradition they'd established, Richard watched the scene with an overflowing heart. Rose, now 8, played a song on the portable piano they'd installed. Outdoors, Helen and Mary set the table, chatting animatedly, and to many people's surprise, Carla was also there. Carla's recovery had been arduous but steady. After completing rehab, she began volunteering at the same center that had helped her, sharing her story to inspire others battling addiction. Her relationship with Rose was different now, no longer mother and daughter in the traditional sense, but as two souls who'd learned love could take many forms. "Dad," Rose called, interrupting his thoughts. "Want to hear the new song I learned?" Richard smiled, sitting beside her on the piano bench. Her small hands, once shaky and fearful, now danced across the keys with confidence. The melody she played was soft and joyful, reflecting the peace she'd finally found. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said when she finished. "Did you compose it?" Rose nodded proudly. "It's our family's song. See? This deeper part is you, strong and steady. These higher notes are me, and these middle ones are Grandma Mary and—" She hesitated a moment, glancing at Carla, who watched from a distance. "My other mom." The simplicity with which Rose had found a way to include everyone in her life, giving each their special place, was a lesson in love that touched them all deeply. That afternoon, as everyone enjoyed the garden sunshine, Richard got a call from his lawyer. The adoption process, which had dragged on for months, was finally complete. With Carla's support, she'd officially relinquished her parental rights, and Helen's testimony about the positive transformation in Rose's life, the judge had granted full adoption. When Richard shared the news, Rose didn't seem surprised. "I already knew," she said with a serene smile. "You did? How?" Richard asked, puzzled. "Because family isn't just paper, Dad, it's this," she gestured to everyone around them. "It's when your heart knows it's home." Helen discreetly wiped a tear, while Carla smiled softly. Mary, who had become much more than an employee over that year, brought out a special cake she'd prepared, as if she'd known this would be a day of celebration. Later, as the sun began to set, Richard found Rose sitting in his old office, now transformed into a shared library. She was thoughtfully looking at the first photo they'd taken together, shortly after her arrival. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sitting beside her. "How things changed," she replied, her voice carrying surprising maturity. "You know, Dad, I think we saved each other." "How so?" "You were alone, Sad. I was hurt, scared, but together we learned to be happy again. And look," she pointed to the window where they could see the rest of the family still gathered in the garden. "We ended up helping other people be happy too." Richard hugged his daughter, feeling the warmth of her small body against his. She was right, as she often was. What had begun as an impulsive act of compassion on an ordinary morning had become a story of redemption, not just for Rose, but for everyone around her. The mansion, which had once echoed only with the silence of loneliness, was now filled with music, laughter, and love. The wounds of the past, though they'd left their scars, had become marks of a journey of overcoming and growth. And in that perfect moment, Richard understood his true wealth wasn't in his bank account numbers or business successes. It was in his daughter's smiles, in Carla's renewed strength, in Helen's wisdom, in Mary's devotion, in the unlikely but perfect family they'd built together. Rose stood from the couch and reached for his hand. "Come on, Dad. Mary made that special hot chocolate, and Grandma said she'd tell stories about when you were little." Richard laughed, letting his daughter lead him toward the garden. The sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, as if nature itself were celebrating the love that had blossomed there. And so, in a mansion that was now truly a home, a family formed through life's fractures continued its journey, proving that sometimes the strongest bonds are those we choose to build, and that love, in all its forms, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds.